Hello everyone, it's Martin aka Anders, and today I'm bringing you another episode of Computing Competitive for all of the different regional Twitch Rivals launch events that happened over this weekend. I'm gonna give it to you straight, if I look a little bit tired, it's because I am. Starting at 7 AM on Friday through last night at 11 PM, I spent 42 out of that 58-hour time frame recording live stats. So I hope you guys enjoy this, and let's get right into it. For those of you that don't know, Twitch Rivals is a massively recurring competition series hosted by Twitch. They partnered with the Valorant developers here to bring us a bunch of launch events for the game. The general model for Twitch Rivals competitions isn't necessarily to bring in the most competitive teams, it's to have the highest profile content creators and public figures in a game space become team captains and then build teams around those individuals. In situations like this, you'll occasionally come up with teams that are totally stacked, like Brax having literally the full SKT roster behind him, and other examples where it's not so much the case, where it's a team of 3 to 5 predominantly content creator types who, while not bad at games, certainly are nowhere near the level of something like a 5 stack of SKT players. Because of that kind of swinginess that we see with the type of players involved, you should take all of these stats with a grain of salt. They're not going to be the law, and in some ways, they're not exactly pure pro play stats, so just keep that in the back of your mind as we go through everything. With that said, these competitions took place in 6 different regions across 8 competitions. The 2 quote-unquote additional competitions occurred in Latin America and Europe, where the regions were split. In Europe's case, you had a Western European competition, as well as a competition that covered predominantly Eastern Europe and Nordic Europe, and in Latin America's case, you had a Latin America North and a Latin America South competition. In total, the regions that were included were Brazil, the 2 subsections of EU, Japan, Korea, the 2 subsections of Latin America, and North America. These competitions were generally structured in a way where you had a group stage, including all of the competitors, that would then break to either a top 4 or directly to a final. With that overview behind us, let's start jumping into the stats. Moving into map play rates, this was obviously one of the first major events where we got to see Ascent on the table, and it actually took up a pretty sizable amount of the metagame, at least more than I think some people might expect. We had Ascent coming in at 17.5%, Bind coming in at 35.5%, Haven coming in at 31.5%, and Split coming in last at 15.5%. The thing that I think would surprise people here is that with Ascent being so new, you'd think that it would at least still be behind Split. I think there might be a little bit of recency bias though, in that people just wanted to try out and take the new map for a swing. That aside, the 2 maps that we saw at the forefront are the ones that we expected, with Bind and Haven making up the overwhelming majority of matches played. Swapping over to map biases, I wanted to take a look at how the skews of these maps panned out insular to this competition. In the cases of both Bind and Split, we get kind of what we expect with them. Bind coming in at a 47-53 skew. Split, however, comes in a little bit less defensively sided than we've seen in the past, likely a result of the changes that were made to the mid on the map, coming in at 46-54. Then we have Haven, which actually flip-flopped. Typically we see this as an offensively sided map, and it's actually swung directly to the inverse, now showing a 49-51 defensive skew instead of a 51-49 offensive skew. This is probably just due to small sample size. And then we see Ascent, which we obviously had no context on, and it's coming in as a defensively skewed map, very similar to Bind in magnitude. As I started to get at with Haven, even though this is a full competition, it's still a very small sample size overall, so all of these should be taken with a grain of salt. Jumping into the real mess of things, let's get into the agent pick rates. To get us through this at least fairly quickly, I'm going to go top to bottom, from the most played to the least played across all of the regions combined, and then I'm going to look at how each regional sub-meta varied. Starting at the top, it's the usual culprit with Sage, but quite a bit lower than we usually see her. Obviously, the nerfs in the recent patch made people a lot more willing to step out of their comfort zone and at least try different stuff. Next up, we have Brimstone coming in at 80.9%, a little bit lower than usual, but at least where we expect him generally on the ladder. A similar situation occurring with Cypher coming in at 78.5%. Now things get messy. Reyna, who you may remember if you've watched my more recent videos, I said wasn't going to see a lot of pro play, comes in at the 4th most played at 55%. I'm going to get into this in a lot more depth later, so I'm just going to gloss over it for now. Following Reyna, we have Raze coming in at 47.7%, Sova coming in at 44.3%, Breach quite a bit further down than usual at 30.9%, Phoenix below him at 28.2%, Jett lower than I was expecting to see her at 19.5%, Omen vastly lower than I was expecting him to be, especially given his recent buffs, at 17.8%, and still hard stuck at the bottom of the ladder, we have Viper barely scraping along at 5.0% flat. Moving on, let's take a look at how things varied in certain regions versus the aggregate, starting with Brazil. In Brazil, we saw a couple minor nuances, the most significant being that Cypher was higher play rate than Brimstone, flipping those 2 slots, and that Jett jumped significantly up the ladder to the middle of the pack instead of being 3rd from the bottom. Next up we have EU, who very similar to Brazil had 2 major shifts, the same flip-flop between Brimstone and Cypher, as well as a big jump up the ladder for a single agent. However, instead of Jett, with them it was with Sova, who jumped all the way up to the 4th slot. Next up we have Japan, which has a significantly more muddled couple of changes than the other 2 regions we've touched on so far. Much like Brazil, it had a big spike in Jett play, but even more so, jumping her all the way to the 4th most played. You also saw a couple other jumblings, where Reyna comes in significantly lower than the other regions, and Omen actually makes quite a bit of a surge up towards the middle of the pack. Moving on to Korea, it's almost a carbon copy of the overarching play rates across all of the different regions, the major divergence being that Breach is quite a bit lower, and Omen goes significantly up towards the middle of the pack. This is the region he was played most across the world. Next up with the Latin American competitions, we have a tier list that looks more like something we would expect from pre-launch back in the beta. We have the common core coming in as the top 4 most played, with Sage, Cypher, Brimstone, and Breach. Then you have Reyna coming in still very high in the pecking order, and then the rest of it fleshes out almost exactly as we'd expect in past tier lists. Last but not least, we have North America, which again is very similar to the overall play rates that we saw across all of the regions, the entire top 5 being identical. The major divergence we see is that Phoenix makes a little bit of a surge, bouncing Sova down, Breach swings a little bit up, and Omen swings a little bit up, but overall it's mostly just single slot upticks and downticks. After taking a look at all of these, nothing is super surprising, except for Reyna. You guys know if you've been looking at my other content that I wasn't expecting her to be extensively played, and I think the fact that she was played a lot here doesn't necessarily prove me wrong yet. Like I said, this isn't exactly super competitive pro play, and I think people's inclination to just sort of send it is a little bit higher than usual. Their willingness to play stuff that isn't necessarily a purely optimized meta goes up. But even so, with that caveat, I think this is a very high play rate that can't really be ignored. So we'll see how this pans out. I'm super interested to see in the coming weeks and tournaments outside of just Twitch Rivals whether or not Reyna continues to see this type of play rate. Something that is super interesting that I will add in though, is that if you stratify the dataset that I have to only be top 4 situations, Reyna's play rate drops through the floor. As soon as people were playing for serious swings in the amount of money they were taking home, they got super serious and stopped playing her. That tells you something. Comparatively, moving into win rates, we see tons of exciting stuff. Topping the entire ladder at almost 55% win rate, Jett comes in swinging big time. If you look at why this was happening, I think it boils down to exactly which teams were playing it on a consistent basis. If we look over at EU, Team WTCN was playing it in the EU East competition, making a run all the way to 2nd and playing it in literally every single game that they played. In EU West, you had Team Sola playing it, where Lucker was behind the pilot seat and completely popping off on it almost every single round. And then if we look over at NA, you had Wardell on Team Myth, which was basically Mousebaz or TSM now, plus Myth, and he was completely popping off. They ran all the way to 2nd overall and even managed to take T1 to 3 games despite not having their normal 5 stack and having Myth as part of the roster. That's not to take anything away from Myth, but the fact that that team was taking T1 with their full normal roster to 3 games is absolutely insane. Next, we have another pick completely out of left field, where Viper's coming in at 52.6% win rate, despite being bottom of the table in play rates. This one I know exactly who to blame on, and that's Mixwell. Mixwell loves to pull out Viper on both Bind and Ascent, and he crushes people with it. Going further down, things get a little bit less exciting. We have Sova coming in at a win rate that's very similar to his overall win rate, Sage coming in slightly above 50%, which reflects the fact that she's dropped a little bit in play rate. We get to see her swing a little bit further away from the 50-50 that we see whenever she's picked on both sides. This tells us that in the 8 or so percent where she wasn't being played, she was pretty consistently being on the winning side. The takeaway that we can tentatively pull from that is that Sage is still basically a required piece. If you're not picking her, you're probably going to be losing. Next up, we have a big clump where we have Cypher, Breach, and Omen all at 50.1%. The one part of this that does have a bit of intrigue doesn't fully flesh out until we look at the next agent down the list in Brimstone, and that's that Omen comes in significantly higher than him. Many of you will know that I've been a proponent of bringing in Omen instead of Brimstone for sort of that smoke stall tactic playstyle, and this confirms it. Time after time we see Omen coming in at higher win rates than Brimstone, and yet people still seem quite hesitant to bring him in as an alternative. Interestingly, we saw exactly that happen quite frequently with T1's compositions of all people. They would bring in, very often on offense sides, Omen in compositions where you would very commonly see Brimstones. The perfect example of this being actually their most played comp throughout the competition, which was Breach, Cypher, Omen, Reyna, and Sage, which many of you will quickly notice is quite literally just the common core plus Reyna, where they've brought in Omen instead of Brimstone. And that brings us more formally to Brimstone himself, who came in at a 49.3% win rate. I'll be totally blunt, I think that if he didn't have such a good ultimate, we would already see a play rate switch between him and Omen, and that might still come in the near weeks. Next up, we have one that's going to tilt a lot of people, and that's that Reyna was just straight up bad. She came in at a 49% win rate, despite the fact that she was played very widely and by many of the top teams. Obviously, this is Twitch Rivals, so not super serious, and it's a relatively small sample size, but this is already starting to swing in the direction of my original hypothesis, which is that Reyna shouldn't be seeing a lot of pro play. Next up is one that technically shouldn't surprise us given historic numbers, but is still pretty brutal every time I have to read it out loud, and that's that Raze comes in at 48.4%. This goes contrary to everything in my head, where we see her play tons in EU to tremendous success, but as soon as you go almost anywhere else in the world, she seems to fall flat, and so her win rate is always way lower than I sort of have it subconsciously benchmarked in my head. Trailing quite a bit behind, we have Phoenix at 46.6%. Clearly, at least based on initial impressions, the buffs that he received on the release patch were nothing near what they needed to be, supporting the hypothesis that I had in my overarching beta summary. He needs more buffs. Point blank. You can't have multiple other entry alternatives with 2+ second long flashes and then expect him to be okay with a 1.1 second flash. Just buff his flash duration. We'll see at least a half to a full percentage point increase if you bring it up to something like 1.5 to 1.75, and then he'll actually be an agent that can compete with his alternatives. Alright, so that gets us through map pick, map bias, agent pick, agent win. Now we get to my favorite part, which is agent compositions. What did they look like in each individual region and overall? Let's get right into it. First, I wanted to take a look at the top played composition for each region, because this will give us a really good baseline understanding of what's underpinning the numbers to come. We'll quickly see that there's a major common thread in that Brimstone, Cypher, and Sage occur in all of the top comps for every region. The remaining 2 slots always went to an entry fragger, be it Breach or Reyna, and the other slot went to either another aggressor in something like a Jet for an op position, a Raze for an op position, or a Sova for additional intel. A couple of you more sharp-eyed viewers will realize I didn't have NA here, and there's a reason for that. NA was the only region that had a flat-out tie for the most played composition. They had the common core plus Raze, as well as a weird amalgam comp that we haven't seen before really. This composition is a super odd beast, and was actually a hallmark of Team Myth, the TSM/MSPAS roster that made it all the way to second versus T1, and they ran Phoenix, Brimstone, Omen, Sage, and Jet. When you contextualize that that's who was playing it, it makes a lot more sense. Even more so when you distill the components down to their archetypal roles. You had Phoenix playing an entry slot, you had Brimstone playing his standard utility role, you had Sage playing her standard anchor role, and the remaining two were really the only aberrations that we saw, with Jet playing sort of a forward flank role, typically taking up an operator, and then you had Omen replacing Cypher of all things, but playing sort of a lurker and secondary utility role. The reason that they were willing to make this swap out, despite the fact that Omen is a significant inferior to Cypher in that sort of vertical role, you have to remember that Myth is an Omen one-trick. They were given the player that they were given, and they built a phenomenal comp that filled all the archetypal necessities around that player's agent pool. This may not necessarily be the most optimized version of this comp, where it's still running Phoenix instead of a different entry, but when you lay it out like that, everything makes sense, and it's actually kind of a masterpiece given the circumstances they were dealt. That all said, I would never expect this to be a composition that we suddenly see at the forefront of pro play. It was very clearly tailored to their situation. Now that we have the top compositions from every region, what did it look like at the highest level across all of the regions? And panning over to it, we immediately see that same 3-agent core, Brimstone, Cypher, and Sage, across the entirety of the top 5. And we also see a similar pattern as before, where the remaining 2 slots are generally going to be filled with an entry and then sort of a secondary aggressor or intel agent. We see the same Reyna and Breach entry options, and the same Jet, Raze, Sova secondary options, except for the middle composition, where we see a little bit of a divergence, where they choose to go for 2 secondary options and forego typical entry utility. If we look at exactly how played and how successful these compositions were, we see that they were relatively clustered near the top, with only the 5th comp being a significant drop in terms of play rate, all of the others being between 7.1% and 8.4% of the overall meta. Moving over to win rates, things get a little bit messier. The top comp is validly so with a 51.4% win rate. Moving into second though, it does quite poorly with a 46.6% win rate. Then we have that middle comp that was a little bit odd, foregoing the entry tools at 50.6%. Then the 4th comp comes in at a killer 54.5%. Interestingly, this is just a run-of-the-mill Common Core plus Raze comp. This tells me that maybe the meta shouldn't be shifting as aggressively as it is, or at the very barest minimum, that we're still way better at the old tools and old compositions we have than we are messing around with anything in this new meta format. Then last on the totem pole, we had 51.8% for the comp running Reyna and Jet. Something I want to take a minute to discuss is the top comp played across all of these compositions. For those of you that watched my Reyna meta-analysis, this comp's going to look familiar. It is quite literally the comp that I said was going to be the best home for Reyna. It found its way to the most played composition in the first major tournament after Reyna's release, a massive confirmation of my hypothesis that this composition was well suited to her toolkit. And while I still don't believe that Reyna deserves to be a particularly meta pick or something that we see super commonly, it's reaffirming to know that at least when she does show up, it's in a format that is predictable. And so those were the Twitch Rivals Launch competitions. I'll reiterate one last time that these weren't really peak competitive events. The team structures were different, the format was different, we didn't see a lot of pure competitive 5-stacks, so all of this should be taken with a grain of salt. But what it does do is it gives us a fairly good barometer for what we can expect moving forward. In that vein though, let me know in the comments down below what you guys think. Do you think there are certain things from this that we're going to see a lot of? Do you think that there are things from this that were totally out of left field and you don't expect to see moving forward? What are your thoughts on Reyna's place in the meta? Do you think that the skew that we saw on Ascent is actually going to be accurate moving forward? Super curious about what your guys' thoughts are on it. Let me know down below. As always, if you're enjoying my content, don't forget to like and subscribe. If you're really liking stuff, you can also find me on Twitter and Instagram at AnderzzTV, as well as streaming over at Twitch at AnderzzTV. But that's all I got. Thanks as always, and I'll see you in the next one.